Commander Sarah Voss stood before the Grand Assembly of the Galactic Sovereignty, her datapad trembling slightly in her gloved hand. She was one of only 11 humans ever granted speaking rights inside the crystalline hall of Xyrath Prime, and the weight of that privilege pressed down on her like a collapsed star. Above her, the domed ceiling shimmered with projected stellar maps, thousands of civilizations glowing like fireflies caught in amber. The hall was filled with representatives from over 400 species. Vorkai senators, tall and bioluminescent, floated in their anti-gravity rings. The Thuan delegation clustered together, their chitinous shells clicking softly as they communicated in subsonic pulses. At the highest tier, the Eternal Council of Nine, the true rulers of the sovereignty, sat behind a semicircle of black glass, their faces unreadable. Sarah cleared her throat. "Honored members of the Galactic Sovereignty," she began, her voice translated simultaneously into 42 languages through the hall's quantum interpreter. "My name is Commander Sarah Voss of the Terran Advanced Science Division. I have traveled 86 light-years to bring you information that cannot wait." She activated the holographic display above the central podium. A model of Earth's solar system bloomed into existence, pulsing with concentric rings of energy readings. 12 months ago, our deep space monitoring arrays detected anomalous tectonic resonance patterns emerging from Earth's outer mantle layer. These patterns are not geological. They are structured. Repeating. Intelligent. A murmur rippled through the assembly. "We believe," Sarah continued, her jaw tight, "that something has been dormant beneath Earth's surface for approximately 40 million years. Our models indicate it is beginning to wake." The murmuring grew louder. Ambassador Druth of the Vorkai delegation raised one luminescent appendage. "Commander Voss, are you suggesting that your planet, a Class 7 biosphere barely 2 centuries into spaceflight, harbors some form of ancient intelligence? One that has escaped all sovereignty surveys and probes?" "Yes," Sarah said simply. "That is exactly what I am suggesting." The laughter began softly, a low hum from the Thuan sector, then rippled outward until even the Vorkai were buzzing with quiet amusement. One of the Council of Nine, Elder Proxim Valder, leaned forward, his ancient face carrying the patience of someone who had lived through 7,000 years of galactic history. "Commander Voss," he said in that slow, resonant voice, "we have surveyed Earth 41 times over the past 3 millennia. Our instruments are the finest in the known galaxy. Your world is a beautiful, ordinary biosphere. Its dominant species, your people, are remarkable for their rapid technological development certainly, but Earth itself is unremarkable. There is nothing beneath your crust but molten rock and tectonic plates." Sarah pulled up the data readouts. Line after line of seismic signatures, electromagnetic pulses, gravitational microfluctuations. "Then explain these, Elder Valder." Valder glanced at the data for exactly 4 seconds. "Geological noise. Your instruments are young. Your interpretive models are immature. We appreciate your diligence, Commander, but the sovereignty cannot mobilize on the basis of readings from a civilization that learned faster than light travel less than 200 years ago." He folded his hands. "We will log your report. You may return to Earth." Sarah looked out at the assembled galaxy, 400 species, thousands of years of combined knowledge, the mightiest political and military body in the known universe, and felt something cold settle in her chest. "You are making a mistake," she said. "It would not be the first time a young species overestimated the significance of their homeworld," Valder replied gently, and that gentleness was somehow worse than contempt. Sarah gathered her data pad. She did not argue further. She had the readings. She had the models. She had Dr. Callum O'Sea's full theoretical framework, peer-reviewed by every leading geophysicist on Earth, which described in terrifying detail what the patterns beneath the crust might mean. As she walked out of the crystalline hall, the stellar map on the dome behind her continued to glow peacefully, Earth a tiny unremarkable dot in one quiet spiral arm. She boarded her ship and set course for home. Behind her, the Grand Assembly resumed its regular business. Trade disputes, boundary negotiations, the routine administration of a galaxy that had seen everything and feared nothing. None of them checked the Earth readings again. 8 months later they would regret that deeply. Dr. Callum O'Sea was waiting for Sarah when her ship touched down at Terran Science Station Khartoum, Earth, at 3:47 in the morning. He was a broad-shouldered man from Accra with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers, and he was holding a tablet displaying numbers that made Sarah's stomach drop the moment she saw them. "It's accelerating," he said without preamble. "How fast?" "Twice the rate from last month." He handed her the tablet. "Sarah, whatever is down there, it isn't waking up slowly anymore. She stared at the numbers. Then she looked up at the African sky, brilliant with stars that were also the territory of a civilization that had just laughed her out of its most important room. Then we deal with it ourselves, she said. Callum nodded slowly. I was afraid you'd say that. Were you? He almost smiled. No. I was counting on it. The drilling rig they called Needle 12 was the deepest human-made bore on the planet, extending 31 kilometers into the Earth's lower crust. It had been built in secret, funded by a coalition of 12 nations under a classified infrastructure budget, and staffed by the most paranoid and brilliant geologists, xenobiologists, and theoretical physicists that humanity could assemble. Dr. Callum Osei stood at the primary monitoring console, surrounded by 4 walls of screens showing data feeds from Needle 12 sensor array. Beside him, Dr. Yuna Sato, a xenobiologist from Osaka who had spent 15 years studying the chemical signatures of alien microbiomes, was running comparative analyses with a focus that suggested she had not slept in roughly 40 hours. The resonance pattern is now showing deliberate variation, Yuna said, not looking up from her screen. Variation consistent with structured communication. Communication with what? Asked Lieutenant Reagan Abra from the security station behind them. He was the youngest person in the room and the only one carrying a weapon, which he was beginning to feel very self-conscious about. That, Callum said, is the question. What they had detected over the previous 3 months was not a creature in the conventional sense. The patterns emanating from below the lower mantle were not biological in origin, or at least not biological as any human or known alien science could classify. They were geometric. Precise. The signals moved through the rock the way a musician moves through a score. With intention, with structure, with something that felt disturbingly like awareness. Commander Sarah Voss arrived at Sublevel 9 at 0600, fresh from a briefing with the Terran Defense Council in Geneva. She looked like someone who had received news that was simultaneously terrible and vindicating. The Council has approved Operation Stone Cradle, she said. Full resource allocation. Whatever we need. What changed their minds? Callum asked. 3 things. She held up a finger. Cape Town registered a 6.2 magnitude quake last night with no known fault activity in the area. A second finger. Our orbital arrays detected a gravitational anomaly beneath the Indian Ocean that the Sovereignty's instruments missed because they weren't calibrated for its specific resonance frequency. Third finger. And one of Needle 12's deep probes stopped transmitting at 0300 this morning. Not a malfunction. The feed cut clean mid-signal, as if something decided it was done being observed. The room was quiet. It knows we're here, Yuna said softly. Possibly, Sarah agreed. Or it simply reacted to the intrusion the way any organism reacts to a needle being pushed through its skin. Reagan shifted uncomfortably. Were the needle in that analogy? Yes. Over the following 6 weeks, the team built a picture that was equal parts magnificent and terrifying. What lay beneath Earth's crust was not a single creature but a distributed intelligence. A vast network of crystalline biomineral structures woven through the lower mantle like the neurons of a brain the size of a small continent. It had been there for approximately 42 million years. Long before the first hominids stood upright on the African savanna. Long before the dinosaurs. Long before even the great Permian extinction that had reshaped the biosphere above it. It had been dormant. Or perhaps not dormant. Perhaps simply patient in a way that biological life operating on human timescales could not intuitively grasp. Patient the way geological formations are patient. And now, for reasons that Callum's models could only partially explain, it was cycling up. Its electromagnetic output had increased 400% in the past 3 months. Its gravitational signature was becoming measurable from orbit. And the structured resonance patterns were growing more complex, developing layers of nested information that Yuna described in a moment of quiet awe, as the most sophisticated natural language structure I have ever encountered. Can we communicate with it? Sarah asked. We're trying, Yuna said. But the frequency range and encoding system are unlike anything in our xenolinguistics database. We're essentially trying to learn a language that was ancient before multicellular life existed. How long do you need? Yuna looked at the data wall. Years probably. If it cooperates. What if it doesn't cooperate? Yuna had no answer for that. At 2300 on a Tuesday night, Needle 12's entire sensor array lit up simultaneously. Every screen in sublevel 9 flashed white. The floor shook, not violently but with a deep, rolling, purposeful tremor, like a drumbeat from the center of the world. Then from the audio sensor still active in the bore shaft, came a sound. It was not sound in the conventional sense. It was infrasound, frequencies below human hearing range, translated by the system's processors into a waveform that the speakers rendered as a low, resonant hum that vibrated in the chest and behind the eyes. But within that hum, Yuna's analysis software flagged something. Structure. It's talking, she whispered. To us? Reagan asked. She shook her head slowly, staring at the waveform analysis. Her face had gone pale. No, she said. To something else. They pulled up the directional analysis. The signal was being projected upward, through the crust, through the mantle, through the ocean, into the sky. Into space. Callum turned to Sarah. She was already reaching for the quantum communicator. We need to call the sovereignty, he said. We need to call them, she agreed. Whether they listen is another matter. She looked at the ceiling above them, kilometers of rock between them and the sky, and somewhere above that sky, a galaxy that had laughed at her 4 months ago. Start preparing the emergency broadcast, she said. Maximum priority channel. And Callum, include everything. Every reading, every model, every piece of data we have. Make it impossible to dismiss. And if they dismiss it anyway? Sarah looked at the waveform on the screen, that ancient, patient, incomprehensible signal reaching upward into the dark. Then humanity will handle it alone, she said. Like we always have. The sovereignty's response came not as a military fleet or a science vessel but as a single diplomatic courier bearing the personal seal of Elder Proxim Valder. Inside the courier was Arbiter Thessan Mirova, a Vorkai diplomat of the 63rd Order, renowned throughout the galaxy for her skill in what the Vorkai called graceful de-escalation, which in practice meant convincing younger civilizations that their crises were less significant than they believed. Thessan was 214 years old, silver-skinned, and possessed of the languid calm of someone who had personally mediated 47 first-contact disputes, 12 planetary succession wars, and 1 incident involving a Thuan colony accidentally terraforming an inhabited moon. She had heard, she was absolutely certain, every variation of the "our planet is special" argument that a spacefaring species could devise. She requested to meet Commander Sarah Voss and Dr. Callum O'Shea on Sovereign Station Orlith rather than on Earth. Sarah accepted immediately and then spent 3 hours preparing a presentation that she privately described to Callum as designed to penetrate the professional skepticism of someone who has seen everything and assumes they understand all of it. Callum had added, so basically the same thing you tried at Zyrith Prime, but more aggressively documented. No, Sarah had said. This time we have the signal. They can't dismiss a direct broadcast from an entity operating from inside our planet's mantle. The meeting room on Orlith was a featureless white space that sovereignty stations used for sensitive negotiations. Neutral, undistracting, equipped with the finest translation and holographic technology available. Arbiter Thessan arrived with 2 assistants and the specific expression of someone performing a professional courtesy they privately considered unnecessary. Sarah activated the holographic array without preamble. The full dataset bloomed across the room. Seismic readings, electromagnetic signatures, gravitational anomalies, and most critically the recorded signal from Needle 12's audio sensors, translated into a visual waveform that danced and pulsed across 3 meters of air. This, Sarah said, was recorded 14 days ago at 31 kilometers depth beneath Earth's lower crust. It lasted approximately 40 minutes. Yuna, Dr. Sato, what have you determined about its content? Yuna, present via quantum link from Earth, appeared as a holographic figure beside the data display. The signal contains nested informational structures operating on at least 6 simultaneous encoding layers. The outer layers appear to be, for lack of a better term, identification sequences, the equivalent of an entity stating its presence in nature. The inner layers are more complex and we have achieved only partial translation, but the core message structure appears to be a form of territorial declaration combined with what our models interpret as a warning. Arbiter Thessan was no longer wearing her professional calm. She leaned forward, her silver fingers interlaced. A territorial declaration directed where? Upward, Yuna said. Into space. Toward coordinates our astrophysics team has identified as the approximate location of the Keth boundary, the outer edge of sovereignty space in this sector. The room was very quiet. The Keth boundary was significant because on the other side of it lived the Keth Collective, an expansionist civilization that the sovereignty had been in a Cold War-adjacent diplomatic stalemate with for approximately 600 years. The Keth were large, methodical, and currently in the middle of a gradual territorial expansion that had brought their nearest colony to within 4 light-years of Earth's solar system. The entity beneath Earth, Thessan said slowly, is broadcasting a signal directed at Keth space. Not directed at it, Yuna corrected. Responding to it. Our back analysis of earlier signal data suggests the Keth have been transmitting toward Earth's coordinates for approximately 18 months. Something in their expansion pattern appears to have been deliberately approaching Earth's solar system, not for its biosphere, not for human civilization, but for what lies beneath the crust. Thessan sat back. Behind her professional composure, something that might have been genuine alarm was assembling itself. They know what's down there, Callum said from beside Sarah. The Keth. They've known far longer than we have. We think their expansion pattern over the past century has been navigating toward Earth specifically. Toward it. Why? Thessan asked. Our best theory, Sarah said, is that what lives beneath our planet is something the Keth want. Or fear. Or both. She advanced the holographic display to the final element of the presentation, a comparative analysis that their orbital arrays had constructed by studying the Keth's expansion trajectory across 2 centuries of sovereignty recorded data. A line drawn through the stars, bending gently, adjusting course at each major Keth expansion event, always curving toward a single quiet point in space. For 42 million years, Sarah said, whatever sleeps beneath our planet has been left alone. No one knew it was there. The sovereignty's instruments weren't calibrated to detect it. Earth's own inhabitants evolved above it in complete ignorance. But now it is waking up, and the Keth are responding, and if either of those 2 facts had been caught earlier, perhaps by the sovereignty investigating our warning 4 months ago, we might have had time to understand what we are dealing with before the situation became urgent. Arbiter Thessan Mirova sat with her silver hands folded and said nothing for a long moment. Then, I need to transmit an emergency report to the Council of 9. Please do, Sarah said. We'll wait. The transmission took 40 minutes. When Thessan returned to the meeting room, she carried herself differently, the practiced ease of the professional diplomat replaced by something more immediate. The Council requests full data transfer, she said. And they request that humanity refrain from further deep-bore intrusion until a joint assessment team can be assembled. The Council requests, Sarah repeated carefully. Does that mean they believe us now? Thessan paused. Elder Valder's exact words were, tell Commander Voss that we are reconsidering our earlier assessment. Callum made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Tell Elder Valder, Sarah said, that we would appreciate the Council reconsidering faster. That night, 3 sovereignty fleet groups quietly altered their patrol routes to bring themselves within rapid response range of Earth's solar system. It was, Sarah noted when she reviewed the positional data, the fastest the sovereignty had ever moved in response to a human concern. It was also, she suspected, not nearly fast enough. They came without announcement, which was itself a message. 23 Keth warships dropped out of faster-than-light transit at the edge of Earth's solar system at 4:12 GMT on a Thursday morning, arranging themselves in a formation that Terran Defense Council analysts immediately identified as a perimeter establishment pattern, the configuration the Keth used when they intended to claim and hold a volume of space, not attack through it. They were not here for humanity. That distinction, Colonel Yemi Adaora of Terran Orbital Defense Command noted in her initial assessment, was both reassuring and profoundly unsettling. The Keth were a tall, calcified species, their biology based on silicon carbide compounds that gave them a geological quality, as if someone had decided to build a civilization out of living rock. They communicated through precisely modulated pressure waves and regarded biological species the way a mountain might regard a river, with a distant acknowledgement of an entity operating on a completely different timescale. They had never attacked humanity. They had also never communicated with humanity. Until now. The signal came through on standard sovereignty diplomatic frequencies, translated automatically by the Earth Orbital Relay Network. It was brief. Biological residents of the third orbital body, you are advised to relocate to minimum safe distance from your planet's surface. Events will occur that your current technological level cannot manage. Evacuation corridors are being established. Use them. Colonel Adaora stared at the message for approximately 4 seconds, then transmitted it simultaneously to Commander Sarah Voss at Station Khartoum, Arbiter Thessan Mirova at Orlith, and the Terran Defense Council in Geneva. Voss's response arrived in 30 seconds. Do not comply. Do not evacuate. Hold position. I'm on my way. Adaora appreciated the clarity. She also noted that Voss's instructions to hold position were rather easier to give from 31 kilometers underground than to receive while sitting in orbital space watching 23 Keth warships organize themselves with the methodical patience of civilizations that measured time in geological epochs. The Keth's next transmission arrived 4 hours later and was more specific. The entity beneath this planet's crust is entering its active phase. It will attempt to establish surface interface within 12 of your planetary rotations. This process will be energetically significant. Your surface is not rated for it. We are here to manage the process and contain surface impact. Stand down or be cleared. Sarah arrived at orbital command via priority shuttle at 0900. She was carrying a data pad, a thermos of coffee, and the expression of someone who had been expecting exactly this conversation. They're not here to invade, she told Colonel Adaora immediately. They're here for the entity. They want us out of the way so they can, what? Extract it? Communicate with it? Suppress it? Unknown, Adaora said. That's the problem. Sarah pulled up the Keth's two transmissions side by side. Look at the phrasing. Manage the process. Contain surface impact. They're not trying to protect humanity out of altruism, they're trying to prevent something from interfering with what they're here to do. You think the entity is a threat to them? I think the entity is something the Keth have been trying to reach for a very long time, and now that it's active, they are moving quickly because they're worried someone else might get here first. Sarah looked at the orbital display, the 23 Keth ships, the slowly approaching Sovereignty Response Fleet still 14 hours out, and below them all, the living, waking intelligence beneath the planet's crust. And I think that if we evacuate the surface and let the Keth run this operation unchallenged, we will lose something that belongs to Earth. Something that has been part of this planet for 42 million years. Callum's voice came through the comm link from Khartoum. Sarah. The entity's signal output has increased by 800% in the last 2 hours. Yuna's team has cracked another translation layer. What does it say? Pause. Then Callum's voice, quieter, as near as we can determine, and Yuna wants to flag that this is a partial translation with significant uncertainty. It says, the surface ones are aware. They have tried to speak. This is acknowledged. Adaora looked at Sarah. It knows about us. It's known about us, Sarah said slowly, probably for a very long time. We're just small enough and brief enough that we didn't register as significant. She turned back to the orbital display. Until we started poking a 31-kilometer bore shaft into its outer layer and sending signals into the substrate. We got its attention, Adaora said. We got its attention, Sarah confirmed. She reached for the communications array. I'm going to do something inadvisable. More inadvisable than the bore shaft? Slightly. Sarah opened a direct channel, not to the Keth, not to the Sovereignty, but downward through the orbital relay network, through the Khartoum ground station, through the deepest communication array they had built into Needle 12's bore shaft. Straight down. She activated the transmitter. Then she said, in a voice that was steady because she had decided it would be, My name is Commander Sarah Voss of the Terran species, born on your surface. I don't know if you can understand this. I don't know if you regard us as significant. But this is our home and we would like to understand what happens next. If you are willing to speak to us, we are listening. Static for a long moment. Then Needle 12 sensors lit up in a pattern that Yuna, watching from Khartoum, immediately flagged as a direct, targeted, specifically shaped response. It was not random. It was not geological noise. It was unmistakably a reply. They had not been designed for this conversation. The interface chamber at the base of Needle 12's bore shaft was a cramped space, barely large enough for 2 people and a bank of monitoring equipment, maintained at a temperature just above the threshold where machinery would malfunction and humans would survive. The walls of the shaft here were black basalt laced with the glittering threads of the crystalline network, the outermost visible layer of the entity that lived below. Dr. Yuna Sato had not slept in 31 hours. She was sitting on a folding chair with 4 screens arranged around her, wearing noise-canceling headphones connected to the audio sensor array, with her analysis software translating the entity's signals in something approaching real time. The translation was imperfect. It would always be imperfect, because the entity did not think in words and its communication structures had not been designed for biological reception. But it was something. Commander Sarah Voss stood behind her, watching the translation feed. The entity's name, if name was the right concept, translated approximately as the long patient burning below, a phrase that Yuna had rendered in shorthand as simply pathos, which seemed inadequate but was the best available option. Pathos had existed for 42 million years. It had formed during the Eocene epoch, coalescing from a specific combination of mineral compounds and electromagnetic conditions that occurred in Earth's deep mantle under circumstances that Earth's current geological models suggested would not repeat. It was, in the only meaningful sense, unique. There was no other entity like it anywhere in the recorded catalog of the Sovereignty survey data, which covered approximately 60% of the known galaxy. The Keth knew this, had known it for centuries. What Una had been able to determine from the translation, assembled painfully over the previous 12 hours, was the following. Pathos was not aggressive. It was not malevolent. It was not even particularly interested in the events occurring on its surface, which it perceived the way a human might perceive the activity of microorganisms on their skin, with vague awareness but without urgency. The surface biosphere, including humanity, had been noted, observed. Occasionally its electromagnetic activity had influenced surface weather in ways that earthly geologists had never connected to a source. But Pathos had its own concerns that had nothing to do with life on the surface. Every 42 million years, give or take a geological margin of error, Pathos completed a cycle. The nature of that cycle was not fully translatable into human conceptual frameworks. Una's best analogy was a breath, a vast, slow inhalation and exhalation of energy across frequencies that conventional physics had not yet fully mapped. During the exhalation phase, Pathos would release an enormous burst of electromagnetic and gravitational energy, not destructive by intent, but significant enough to affect anything in the near vicinity, including the surface. How significant? Sarah had asked when Una first explained this. Una had shown her the energy models. Sarah had been quiet for a while after that. The Keth had been aware of Pathos's cycle timing for approximately 300 years. Their expansion toward Earth had been, as Callum had surmised, deliberate, but not to capture or destroy Pathos. The Keth wanted to be present at the exhalation event because the energy released during it carried, embedded within its structure, information. Specifically, the accumulated electromagnetic record of everything Pathos had observed and processed during 42 million years of existence. Knowledge that predated the current configuration of the continents. Knowledge that predated the mass extinctions that had shaped Earth's current biosphere. Knowledge that predated, possibly, the oldest civilizations in the sovereignty. They want to harvest its memory, Callum said from his position monitoring the surface sensor arrays. The exhalation event is going to release 42 million years of stored data, and the Keth want to be positioned to receive it. Can they receive it without harming Pathos? Unknown. But based on their perimeter pattern, I don't think they care whether they do or not. Sarah straightened. She looked at the glittering crystalline threads in the shaft wall. Una, she said. Can you ask Pathos whether it is aware of what the Keth intend? Una worked for 11 minutes, encoding the query through the substrate in the closest approximation of Pathos's own signal structure that her software could construct. She transmitted it downward. The response came in 40 seconds, fast by Pathos standards, which suggested either urgency or the desire to be understood. Una translated it slowly, her voice careful. It says, approximately, that the ones of shaped stone have been circling for many of your lifespans. They intend to stand at the threshold during the release. This was not agreed to. This was not asked of the long patient burning below. A pause as she processed another fragment. It says, the surface ones have asked. This is the first time any surface life has asked rather than taken or ignored. The long patient burning below finds this. The closest translation I have is unexpected and therefore interesting. Sarah felt something that might have been the first genuine moment of hope since this entire situation had begun. Ask it, she said, what it would like to happen. Una looked up at her. We're asking a 42-million-year-old planetary intelligence what it wants. Yes. And acting on the answer. If we can. Una transmitted the query. The response, when it came, required 40 minutes of translation. When Una finally looked up from her screens, her expression was extraordinary, the face of someone who had just been handed something they had no prior framework to hold. It says, Una began, that the release is not dangerous. Not to it and not to the surface, if those nearby are prepared. The exhalation is the natural end of a cycle. The ones of shaped stone want what is released because they are afraid of its content. Afraid of what it will reveal about the early galaxy. Afraid of what 42 million years of deep planet observation has recorded that their histories have chosen not to preserve. Sarah felt the air change in the chamber. And, Una continued, it says, if the small surface ones, it means us, if the small surface ones want to receive what is released, they may stand where the ones of shaped stone cannot. They may have what the Keth fear to let any other species hold. Silence. It's offering us the data, Callum said softly over the comm. It's offering us 42 million years of galactic history, Sarah said. History the Keth apparently do not want shared. She looked at the shaft wall. At the ancient, patient, burning intelligence beyond it. Then she opened the channel to Colonel Adaora in orbit. Tell the Keth, she said, that we will not be evacuating. And get me Arbiter Thessan. We need the Sovereignty here before the exhalation event, and we need them here now. The Sovereignty fleet arrived in system with 4 hours to spare before the Keth's self-imposed deadline, the point at which, by the Keth military's internal calculations, positioning for maximum harvest of Pathos's exhalation event needed to be finalized. 12 Sovereignty warships, 3 science vessels, and the personal command ship of Fleet Admiral Rovan Thessan, no relation to the Arbiter though they shared a species, dropped out of FTL transit at the heliopause and began their approach. It was not a wartime fleet. It was a deterrent fleet, large enough to communicate seriousness, restrained enough to communicate that the Sovereignty preferred not to escalate. The Keth's response was to add 3 more ships to their perimeter. A measured counter-communication. We acknowledge your presence and we are not moving. Arbiter Thessan, who had remained at Station Orlith during the intervening weeks and had spent most of that time in urgent communication with the Council of Nine, arrived at Terran Orbital Command aboard a diplomatic courier and immediately requested a full briefing from Sarah Voss. The briefing lasted 4 hours. When it was over, Arbiter Thessan sat for a long moment with her silver hands flat on the table. You have established active communication with the entity, she said. Yes. Which the Sovereignty's instruments failed to detect for 3,000 years. Our bore shaft provided a direct interface point. The entity chose to respond to us specifically because we asked rather than assumed. Sarah met the Arbiter's eyes. A small behavioral distinction with significant consequences. Thessan absorbed this. The Keth want the exhalation data. They want to be the only ones who receive it. They've apparently known for 3 centuries that this event was coming and have been positioning themselves to harvest it exclusively. The data Pathos will release includes, based on our partial translations, an uninterrupted 42 million year record of electromagnetic, gravitational and biological activity across this region of the galaxy. That includes periods the Keth's own historical records cover poorly. It may include records of events the Keth have reason to want kept out of general galactic knowledge. Thessan was quiet for a moment. You believe the Keth have historical reasons to suppress this data. I believe they have traveled across 4 light-years over a century to ensure they are the only civilization present when it is released. That is a significant investment in exclusivity. The Arbiter looked out the viewport at Earth below. From orbit, it was blue and white and unremarkable, the same quiet world that had never warranted special attention in 41 sovereignty surveys. What does the entity want? She asked. It wants the exhalation to happen as its cycle dictates. It doesn't want the Keth position to filter or control what is received. It offered the data to humanity directly. Sarah paused. I think it has observed the Keth's intentions and finds them a violation of what it considers natural process. The cycle's release is not meant to be harvested by one species in secret. It is meant to simply occur. And your plan? Thessan asked. We position humanity's deep-range receiver arrays at the coordinates Pathos specified. We invite the Sovereignty to do the same. When the exhalation occurs, the data is received openly by multiple parties and cannot be monopolized. Sarah looked at the Arbiter steadily. The Keth cannot object to information being freely received any more than they can object to light. They can only object to being the sole recipients. Thessan was quiet for a long time. Then she said, this will significantly complicate Sovereignty-Keth relations. Yes, Sarah agreed. I imagine it will. You are comfortable with that. The Keth spent a century maneuvering to ensure that 42 million years of galactic history would belong to one civilization exclusively, without the consent of the civilization that produced it. Sarah's voice was even. I am not comfortable with the alternative. The Arbiter studied her for a moment. Then she rose. I will speak with Fleet Admiral Rovan. We will position the science vessels. What followed was 3 days of the most tense non-combat space operations in recent galactic history. The Sovereignty science vessels moved into receiver positions alongside the Terran orbital array, each maneuver carefully calculated to be non-threatening while being unmistakably committed. The Keth shadowed every movement, adding ships, tightening their perimeter, transmitting increasingly pointed advisories. Lieutenant Reagan Abra, now seconded to Terran orbital defense from the ground team, observed the positional chess game from the tactical display and summarized it in a message to Callum. We are essentially telling a civilization of living rocks that they cannot have the world's oldest library to themselves, and they are not pleased. Callum's response, accurate. How are we doing? We're doing what humans do best, Reagan replied. Insisting on being present in situations where everyone else thinks we shouldn't be. Below them, in the deep interface chamber of Needle 12, Una was maintaining a continuous low-level dialogue with Pathos, not attempting to translate the full complexity of the ancient intelligence's thought, but maintaining the connection, keeping the channel open, ensuring that the small surface ones were still present and still asking rather than assuming. On the eve of the exhalation event, Pathos sent one final message through the substrate. It was short. Una translated it carefully. It said, "The surface-borns have stood at the threshold and asked to be counted. This is sufficient. The long patient burning below will give the release freely to those who stand openly. Those who would stand in shadow and take alone will find themselves standing outside the threshold." Una transmitted the message to Sarah in orbit. Sarah read it twice. Then she sent it to Arbiter Thessan and Fleet Admiral Rovan. The Admiral's response was to quietly reposition two Sovereignty warships between the Keth perimeter and the civilian science vessels. The Keth noticed. They did not move. At 3:47 GMT, 16 hours before the predicted exhalation event, Sarah Voss sat in a small observation chair in the Terran Orbital Command Center, looking down at the blue world below, and permitted herself a quiet thought, that a species which had been flying between stars for less than 200 years was now, because it had been polite enough to ask rather than assume, standing at the edge of receiving 42 million years of galactic memory. The galaxy, she reflected, was full of civilizations that had forgotten how to be curious without also being possessive. Humanity, it seemed, had not forgotten yet. Below her the planet breathed. At 1923 GMT, on a clear Tuesday evening, the planet exhaled. There was no explosion. No catastrophic energy release. No surface disruption that would have endangered any human life. What occurred was more fundamental than violence. It was the natural end of a cycle measured in geological time, and it happened with the quiet inevitability of a tide. From deep within the mantle, Pathos released a pulse of structured electromagnetic and gravitational energy that moved through the planet's crust in every direction simultaneously, passing through rock and ocean and atmosphere the way starlight passes through glass, present, pervasive, and carrying information in its structure. At the surface, it manifested as a brief aurora that covered every sky on Earth simultaneously, regardless of latitude, green and gold and deep violet, lasting exactly 9 minutes and 14 seconds. Billions of people stepped outside to watch it. Scientists in 100 countries registered their instruments spiking. Animals went briefly, profoundly still. In orbit, the Terran Receiver Array and the Sovereignty Science vessels registered the data pulse at full strength. Their storage systems, preconfigured by Una's team to the precise encoding frequency Pathos had specified, began capturing what was arguably the largest single data transfer in recorded galactic history. In the Keth perimeter, the warship's own receiver arrays activated. They had been positioned for exactly this moment, refined over a century of preparation. They captured the pulse as intended. But they captured the same pulse as everyone else. It could not be filtered. Could not be monopolized. The exhalation, as Pathos had described it, was not a transmission to a chosen recipient. It was a release, an opening of what had been closed, freely given to anyone standing close enough to receive it. The Keth transmitted one message after the pulse had concluded. It was, by their standards, unusually brief. This outcome was not desired. Sarah received it in the Orbital Command Center, read it, and transmitted a response that she had drafted 2 days earlier in anticipation of exactly this moment. The outcome was the natural result of an entity completing its cycle as it chose, received openly by those who asked permission and stood in plain sight. We hope the Keth will find the shared data informative. The Sovereignty's archivists are available to discuss coordination of the historical record if the Keth delegation wishes to engage. No response came. The Keth fleet began withdrawing from their perimeter positions within the hour, departing Earth's system with the measured efficiency of a species that did not acknowledge setbacks but simply recalculated. Sarah watched them go from the observation chair where she had spent the last 18 hours. "Is that it?" Colonel Adaora asked from across the room. "For now," Sarah said. The data itself took 11 months to partially analyze. Una led the Earthside team. The Sovereignty contributed 7 of its finest xenolinguists and information theorists. 3 independent academic institutions from species that had never previously engaged with Earth research applied for and received access to the full dataset. What they found was not what anyone had expected. Not because it was more dramatic but because it was more personal. 42 million years of deep planetary observation had recorded the electromagnetic signatures of every major species that had ever approached Earth's solar system. Among the records, the survey missions of 12 Sovereignty predecessor civilizations, several of which were believed extinct. The early expansion routes of the Keth, predating their own historical records by 3 centuries, which showed a navigational pattern that strongly suggested the Keth had known about Pathos far earlier than they had admitted to the sovereignty. Evidence of a species that had briefly established an orbital presence around Earth approximately 11 million years ago and then simply vanished without explanation. A complete civilization previously unknown, gone without a trace. And, embedded in the final layers of the data, the most recent recordings from Pathos's perspective, spanning the last 42,000 years, detailed observations of the biological activity on Earth's surface. Of the species that had emerged, developed tools, built fires, told stories, looked up at the sky and wondered. Of humanity, Pathos had been watching. Not with the attention of an observer studying a specimen, but with something that Una, in the paper she published 8 months later and which became the most read scientific document in sovereignty history, described as the quality of attention that a very old, patient thing gives to something unexpectedly vital. The records showed that on 17 separate occasions over the past 12,000 years, Pathos had made minor adjustments to local electromagnetic fields in ways that coincided, not coincidentally, with significant human developments. A slight amplification of certain resonance frequencies in the region of the Fertile Crescent during a period matching the emergence of early agriculture. A pattern of reduced subsurface electromagnetic interference during the period matching early navigation development in Polynesia. Small changes, each individually explicable as geological noise. Together they told a different story. It helped us, Callum said, sitting in the Khartoum cafeteria at midnight looking at the analysis summaries. Not dramatically. Not obviously. Just nudges. Adjustments. The way you might create slightly better conditions for something you wanted to grow. It's been doing this for 12,000 years, Una said. And it never said anything. Never announced itself. Never expected acknowledgement. Until we asked, Callum said. Until we asked. The implications for humanity's self-understanding were significant. The implications for the sovereignty's understanding of Earth were seismic. The Grand Assembly of the Galactic Sovereignty convened a special session to receive the full preliminary data report, and for the first time in its 4,000-year history, a human representative, Commander Sarah Voss, was invited to address the Council of Nine directly, not as a supplicant requesting attention but as a party with information the Council needed to hear. Elder Proxim Valder, at the end of that session, requested a private conversation. I owe you an acknowledgement, he said. He was 7,000 years old and he said it without apparent difficulty. You owe humanity an acknowledgement, Sarah said. He accepted the correction. I owe humanity an acknowledgement. The survey data that led us to dismiss your warning was incomplete because we were not calibrated for what we were looking for. Our instruments and our assumptions were tuned to known categories. Your entity did not fit any known category. No, Sarah agreed. It didn't. You were not, in fact, a young civilization overestimating the significance of your homeworld. He paused. You were a young civilization that happened to live above one of the most significant entities in the known galaxy and noticed it before anyone else did because you were curious enough to drill 31 kilometers into your own planet on the basis of anomalous readings. We were also, Sarah said, polite enough to ask before assuming. That part mattered. Valder was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said finally. That part mattered considerably. In the deep mantle of Earth, Pathos returned to silence. Its cycle was complete. The next would begin in 42 million years, and the surface would carry whatever carried it, and perhaps they would ask again or perhaps they would not, and Pathos would observe either way with the patience of deep time and burning stone. But something had changed. For the first time in 42 million years, there were surface beings who knew it was there. Who had spoken to it. Who had stood at the threshold and asked to be counted and been answered. The small things were brief and loud and wonderfully strange, Pathos had noted in the final layer of the exhalation's data, a postscript addressed to no one and everyone, released with everything else into the open sky. But they asked good questions. And in the great span of deep time that was not nothing. That, in fact, was quite a lot. Below Earth's surface, in the long dark and the slow burning, the ancient intelligence that had watched humanity's ancestors discover fire and agriculture and ships and stars, that had quietly adjusted the conditions for each, settled back into its vast geological patience. Above it, the species that had been born on its surface went on asking questions. The galaxy listened. And this time it knew to pay attention.